it should, if I just do this, it should, yeah, it should. Okay, how about this? Here we go, got it.
We doing all right?
Yeah.
What are we trying to do?
Wait, I'm trying to hook it
Just get video up?
Yeah.
Did it go? They're on.
So maybe it's my... Better? Okay. Make sure your slides... That's it. Yeah, that's not it. Yeah, but I need presenter view here.
You're going to have to switch your display into extended mode.
Oh, okay. And can you show me how to do that?
I think it's function and then F8. Extend. Then,
It's not this. You don't want me to do this.
now, let's reopen your PowerPoint and then see if it can just go. Oh, it's wrong one. It'll...
So what should I do? This thing again?
Nope. We have to switch the show on button here.
Okay.
I'll just do it.
Yep.
There we go. Welcome. You good?
May I have your attention, please? Is this on? Let me try that again. May I have your attention, please? All right. Welcome to each one of you to the Symposium on Race and Racism. Delighted that you're here. I'd like to make just a few comments before we get started. A couple of years ago, when we were planning this symposium, we had no idea of what we were walking into. We very innocently thought this was a good topic, knew nothing, of course, of Ferguson or Baltimore or Charleston, or police shooting people, and people shooting police. We did not know about the refugee crisis in Europe. The situation with racism in Europe is quite different than it is here, but it is very real. There is a refugee problem in Indonesia that very few people even hear about. And there is racism that is within ethnic groups that most people don't stop to talk about.
Preach.
I wasn't preaching yet. But obviously here is a universal problem, a universal issue that the church has something very strong to say about this topic. There's a gospel that says that we are one in Christ. We take that very seriously. We look forward to the contributions from each person. The first person tonight is Love Sechrest from Fuller Theological Seminary, New Testament scholar. And her respondent is a person who is in the leadership of the Covenant Church, Rebecca Gonzales. We are extremely grateful to both of you and your willingness to help us address the issues. If you did not get your registration packet from the table downstairs in the room immediately below this one, you should do that. And if you have not found them, the facilities are at the other end of the hall. There are things that are important in life. With that, I would like to take just a moment to pray. Before I pray, though, let me say one other thing. We've been doing this for, I think this is our, Stephen, 26th year?
I wasn't here when you said
But deans know everything. I think it's the 26th occasion doing this. And we have established a rhythm. We've also established a way to carry on conversation with difficult topics and sometimes a fair amount of disagreement. Sometimes we've been pretty good at doing that, and sometimes it's been a bit comical, just the nature of the case. But there is an ethic and an etiquette about the way we carry on our conversations. If you are unaware, there are about 22 people, I think, in this room who are taking the symposium as a course. And those 22 people are front and center. There's some priority placed upon them. We expect them to be involved in the dialogue. The format, I think, is obvious. We give 30 minutes to the presenter to summarize or highlight what he or she wants to from the paper, because all of us have the paper, and most of us, I think, have read it in advance. The respondent will be given 10 minutes, and the rest of the time we will be in conversation together. With that, let's pray. God of grace, God of goodness, God of love, be with us this night, we pray. May we be aware of your Spirit. Give us the humility to be self-critical of our own thoughts and our own party line. Give us the grace to be able to hear each other, and give us a vision of what the Church of Jesus Christ is supposed to be. We pray for each person involved that your Spirit would be especially present. And may what happens in this symposium in the coming days be worthwhile in your eyes. Amen. So here's the
Well, I am so grateful for the opportunity to be with you and to discuss matters that are deeply embedded in my heart with my brothers and sisters in the Evangelical movement. It is very important that we turn our attention to such things. The title that I landed on, Enemies, Romans, Pigs, and Dogs, I'm also playing around with neighbors, allies, frenemies, and foes. It's a nice ring to it, too. But my attention is on this idea of loving the other, the idea of enemy love. And the Gospel of Matthew has been really helpful in guiding my thinking in these terms. So let's just go ahead and dive right in. As an African-American woman, I think I have an uncomfortable connection with the idea of enemy love. The more one becomes aware of one's social location and as a minority, especially as an African American, the more the whole notion of the more that one's Christian identity comes into conflict sometimes when it comes to matters of justice. If I am stereotyped as a nurturing mammy. How does that connect with the call of the gospel for self-sacrificial other regard? Especially when that kind of self-sacrifice can play right into the hands of oppression, can't it? And so there are times when this whole notion of love for enemies becomes very, very complicated for someone in my social location. And so, especially in the aftermath of the events over the last year, I've just been spending a lot of time thinking about it. Because I can't escape one important idea, and that's the fact that love for enemies, in my view, is one of the highlights, the apex, the towering height of Christian ethics. It's a remarkable thing, especially in view of some of the things I'm going to talk about today. So it's gospel. I have no choice if I follow this Lord. I'm also, as I just said, realize that love for enemies can be a tool of oppression because of my minoritized social location. And all of this really seems to have been especially exhibited in the various responses to the Charleston massacre, right? There were some that wanted to immediately talk about the perpetrator's mental illness. And I think that that's a helpful thing. It draws attention to the sad state of the mental health apparatus in the United States. And so that certainly needs to be said. But it was also true that some saw this as a refusal to come to grips with the heinousness of this crime. Why were we so quick to talk about mental illness and not terrorism? And that kind of a benefit of the doubt sometimes seems to be lacking when it comes to people of color when they are perpetrators, right? So it's become complicated. And in thinking through this, I don't know what it was, but something caught my attention. It's not just that we have to look at giving love to enemies, but I wondered whether there was something in the gospel about being loving as enemies. Is there a responsibility there as well? That's what caught my attention. And I thought that the Gospel of Matthew would be very helpful in, because to tell you the truth, I really think that the same kind of ambivalence in my own, like the conflict, I think that's a better word, the conflict that I have as an African-American woman when it comes to sort of holding justice in one hand and love for enemies in the other. It seems to me that there's an analogous, not identical, but an analogous kind of tension in the Gospel of Matthew, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So, when it comes to thinking about being loving as enemies and thinking about critical race theory, the closest leverage we have to this topic in critical race theory is the whole discourse about being an ally or allyship. Basically, it has to do that allies are members of the majority group. Most people talk about allies, when they talk about allies, they're talking about white allies, especially to people of color. And an ally is one who works to end oppressions of the other in their personal and professional life. They support and advocate with and for the oppressed. And simply put, allies use their privilege for good, for the sake of the kingdom. Now, I did a review in terms of thinking about what the key issues are for white allies, looking at studies that were done of white anti-racist activists themselves to see what they say about what's been important for them to come to grips with. And the first thing that they all talked about is the recognition of white privilege. This is actually an interesting term because white privilege, I think, has become the new flashpoint word, right? Once upon a time, the worst thing you could call someone was a racist. And that became so loaded, those of us working in critical race theory wanted to find something less loaded. And so we began to talk about privilege. Now that one's become very loaded. And that's not just, there's a push and pull on that. I think that there are times when whites who aren't thinking critically about these issues are offended at just raising the idea of privilege. Likewise, there are some occasions when people of color use this like a club, right? Quote, check your privilege. That's not helpful. I think this is an important concept, and it's not helpful to misuse it or to be reductionistic about it. But the white anti-racist whites themselves say this was a critical turning point in the cultivation of their critical awareness. Second, they report that it's important to count the cost of racism to whites. This is a really interesting area of research in social psychology, the cost to whites of racism. The cost of racism to whites. I'm sorry, that's it. The cost of racism to whites. And in the paper, I outlined some of them. This notion that whites are, because whiteness is so invisible, whites are very subtly, but quite compellingly conditioned for hierarchy by adopting the ideologies, the rationalizations, and the behaviors that perpetrate injustice. And if they aren't critically examined, there's no stopping them. Whites have one of the costs of racism to whites, to the white community, is this idea of diminished emotional capacity and resiliency. There's a theorist that I cite in the paper who describes and engages this notion of white fragility. And just one example of that would be the notion that in conversations about race, if people of color express their feelings with passion, with pain, whites become uncomfortable, and they may not realize it, but if they are uncomfortable, they believe that means that the people of color should shut down and shouldn't make them uncomfortable, right? So there's a lack of being able to push through and endure discomfort and pain in hard discussions about racism. So diminished emotional capacity and resiliency. Whites can be locked into race-based standards of behavior. White women, in terms of being docile and giving up agency. White men, in terms of being overly competitive. These are not values in the gospel. Debilitating fears can be a part of the cost of racism to whites. Fear of the other. And then, as whites come to critical consciousness, fear on behalf of the other, right? Beginning to fear for one's friends and colleagues and brothers and sisters who are in minoritized community. Stereotyping. This is something that my own students report I've encountered this in my own classrooms when I teach about race. The notion of being stereotyped as a racist is a painful one and is a cost to whites of racism. There's a story of a friend of mine. So in light of what was it, Sandra Bland, that was the woman who was stopped by for a traffic violation in Texas, right, and ended up dead. So in the aftermath of that one, he was in a routine traffic stop, and as he told the story, he talked about how he was shaking in the encounter, this African-American friend of mine, shaking in the encounter, terrified about what would happen in this traffic stop. And then he became aware that the cop was just as uncomfortable. Because the more my friend's hands shook, the more the cop realized what was going through my friend's mind. He was expecting to get shot, and this cop realized that he was in the position of the bad guy. Right? This is an example of this cop being stereotyped as a racist. And then for Christians especially, there can be this uncomfortable feeling about a lack of integrity. If you're beginning to come to consciousness as a white person, and you're, say, with family or friends, and someone tells a racist joke, and you bow to the social pressure not to speak up, this is a tearing of the soul a little bit for those of us who follow the Savior. So, counting the cost of racism for whites is an important element that that white anti-racist activists report. They say that the next important sort of phase in development is to come to an understanding about oppression, and to do that in a way that doesn't place an undue burden on communities of color. Right? We cannot expect people of color to bleed on demand. And so there are books written that can help people who are in communities not experiencing racism firsthand, to help them grow in their understanding of the nature of oppression. Overcoming fragility, maintaining commitment, right? Maintaining commitment in the face of the social pressure that happens inside white communities when it comes to dealing with matters of race. And then, I love this. Isn't this great? This is a picture taken in Nazi Germany, and you see the one lonely guy who's refusing to salute the Fuhrer, right? And can you imagine how much guts it took to do that? So just an example of how the isolation is a difficult one, and that it's really important for white anti-racist activists to form support groups with other whites, so as to be able to maintain their commitment in some very isolating and difficult circumstances. And then finally, or not finally, but most importantly, taking action, especially among other whites. There is a credibility that white anti-racist activists will have with other whites that I will never have, even though I know more about racism. But there is a credibility I will not have, and so allies are so important. This is the cause of my life, to create coalitions against multiracial, multi-ethnic coalitions against racism. And finally, humility on the part of whites is so important, because when it comes time to take action, it's important to overset the dominant hierarchies of whites in control and leading and people of color behind. And so what's a very difficult component of anti-racist identity development is this cultivation of humility, to let the other lead. And one researcher pointed out something that I just thought was so interesting, and it bears true in my own Christian walk as I reflect on the virtue of humility, and that is that there's a confidence that has to go with that. You think about Jesus when he was about to do the foot washing, right? The verse talks about knowing who he was. He put on an apron and stooped down to wash the disciples' feet, right? So there's a self-confidence that really has to go with the humility in order to be able to be an effective anti-racist ally. Now, when it comes to anti-racist identity development, there's actually quite a bit of debate on what's important here. Some want to argue that there's a crying need for anti-racist identity development among whites, because there is a real feeling of disorientation when whites begin to feel white for the first time. Right, when they realize that they have race, that they are race, because in a racialized society, it's not just the black folk who belong to a race, the white folk do too. And so there's a desire to want to repudiate white privilege. I see this happen in my classes all the time. And if anti-racist identity development doesn't take place, there can be real damage done to self-image and connection to community. On the other hand, some would argue that there are real problems with the whole notion of an anti-racist identity. Some would say, welcome to my world. You don't like being stereotyped? Hello? That's what happens in a racialized society. So sorry. Some suspect that there is a desire to want to sidestep responsibility, right? So I am an anti-racist, so I'm not lumped in with all those other white people. But that's the whole notion of a stereotype. It's when individual encounters become group encounters. Welcome to my world. There's a focus. Some are suspicious of the focus on status versus process. This is the I marched with King approach. So nothing I say can ever be called out as racist because I marched with King. And then, importantly, in my view, is this notion that it could potentially, this whole discourse is about black and white and needs to be moved to include other communities of color as well. And so if it was important for blacks to develop positive self-esteem, why would a Christian want to deny this opportunity to whites who are becoming aware of the fact that they are racist as well? So while I acknowledge that these are important caveats, important things to keep in mind, I think that it's important to cultivate an anti-racist identity after all. So, which brings me to Matthew. I should talk faster, shouldn't I? As I said, Matthew has an ambiguity that I think correlates with some of the ambivalence that I've just talked about at the top. That he has both inclusivistic tendencies and exclusivistic tendencies. Quick examples, the Great Commission, right? Go into all the world, making disciples of all nations. Yet, on the other hand, there is go nowhere among the Gentiles in two places, that one and the Canaanite woman. And so there seems to be these two tendencies. I'm going to briefly just list where we see inclusivism in Matthew. The Magi, right? The come from other places. The Great Commission, as we talked about. The genealogy, which includes Canaanites. Hello. There are the healing of the centurion's servants. We talk about that in more detail. Embedded in that discourse is the many who will come from east and west and eat with Abraham at the eschatological banquet. Exorcism, Jesus goes to Gentile territory and frees two men who are possessed with demons, which seems to some think is an anticipation of the Gentile mission. The kingdom parables in chapters 21 and 22, the Roman soldiers confess at the very end of the gospel. And as I mentioned, this love your enemies. That's just a remarkable thing. Love your enemies. Just a remarkable thing. I'll talk more about that in just a minute. But on the other hand, there is exclusivism in Matthew as well. Stereotypes of Gentiles. They're hostile to outsiders, empty idolaters, materialistic, brutal, and arrogant tyrants, stubborn, hard-hearted outsiders. Right? Are they called swine and dogs in 7:6? We're going to look at that a little bit more. You see that in the picture. Do not give what is holy to dogs. Do not throw your pearls before swine. They are hostile to the disciples. And there's even a suggestion, some think, that the feeding narrative in Matthew 15, which is recording the same event as Mark 8, it seems like Matthew has moved it out of Gentile territory. At least there's a possibility. So I had a summer with Matthew where I wasn't sure he liked Gentiles much. And then there's that line, go nowhere among the Gentiles. That'll make you feel uncomfortable as a Christian, as a Gentile. Any Jews in the room? Yeah, all of us. That's all of us. But I drilled down and thought about Jesus as oppressed by Rome. Yeah? And so it began to flip my understanding of what was going on in Matthew. And I think some of the ambivalence is due to external pressure. Some think that the most likely setting for Matthew is Antioch, and there was, in the aftermath of the Jewish war, a lot of the Syrians in Antioch took the opportunity to do more oppression because they figured it was open season on Jews. Lateral pressure, hostility from the Pharisees. See, all Jews were trying to figure out, what do we do now that the temple's gone? And so there's competition inside of the God movement, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, as to who would interpret the tradition going forward. We know that Antioch is also Paul's headquarters for a Gentile mission, a law-free Gentile mission. And we know how Matthew feels about the law, right? Go into all the world, teaching the nations everything I've told you, including the fact that not one jot or tittle of the law will pass away, yeah? Matthew likes the law. So a law-free Gentile mission may not have been all that appealing to Matthew. And so I think all of these things combine to produce some ambiguity about outsiders. One that I said, as I've said, is analogous in some ways to the ambiguity I have as a Christian of color. I wanted to start, and so in this section, I want to talk about how I began to think about how the enemies in Matthew are depicted. Not so much how Jesus relates to them. Jesus is loving, right? Jesus frees, liberates, and forgives. Done, we know that one. But I wanted to see how Matthew talked about the enemies of Jesus, right? I know that I have a responsibility in the gospel to love enemies, but I was really curious about how Matthew wanted to say enemies should behave if they want to be in relationship with Jesus. And so that's what I do in this section. Looking at first that problematic or that puzzling verse in 7:6, don't give holy things to dog or pearls before swine. When you look at when you look at the use of swine in Jewish and Christian literature, there's a debate about whether they are used to stereotype Gentiles that Jesus was calling Gentile swine, pigs. That's not so cool. But it does seem to denote, it is used in text to denote those things that are very un-Jewish. And so those who do not worship God according to Torah, and very often it's talking about other Jews in these kinds of texts. But because I think the overall point of the saying is to be cautious in sharing holy things, because pigs are dangerous, especially these wild boars, since there were no domesticated pigs in Jewish territory, right? Some lack discernment. When it comes to sharing with enemies, some of your enemies are going to lack discernment. Others may become violent. And I think, going now to dog imagery, and when you look at how dog imagery is used in Jewish and Christian literature, they depict what is vicious and ravenous and wild. They will turn on a dime and trample you or maul you. And thus, at least in 1 Enoch, both dog and pig imagery is used to describe Gentiles who are impure, unfit for community, and highly dangerous. And so when Jesus goes into Gentile territory and exorcises demons from some really violent men, demon-possessed men, this is exposing how dangerous it is to go among enemies and share the gospel. So I think that this the Gadarene demoniac exorcism really is an illustration of what's going on in 7:6. And I wanted to call those folks the foes. Those are the folks who are not ready for discussions about race relations. They are dangerous. They may not know what they're doing, They are under the influence of evil forces, and you have to be careful when it comes to trying to have these kind of conversations with them. In Matthew 8, 5 to 11, we have the story of Jesus' encounter with a centurion, and the centurion represents a powerful, oppressive enemy, a military force in Matthew's living memory when he wrote. Here, an enemy puts himself in a position of submission to Jesus. Right? Jesus is the minority in this relationship. And the centurion submits himself to that and puts himself into a relationship that way. He has his own agency. He knows he's powerful, but he trusts in Jesus' ability. I think that this passage, especially as we compare it with what's going on with the Canaanite woman episode, I think Matthew implies that it's easier to reconcile with a recent enemy. I call centurions neighbors. They are analogous to how communities of color should be in relationship with other minorities. Even if I know a lot about oppression as an African American woman, I don't know anything about what it means to live as a Latina. I don't know anything about what it means to live as an Asian American woman or a Native American woman. I don't know that. And so if I want to be an ally to them, I need to be submissive like the centurion, trust in their ability to advocate for what their communities need, and support them. Centurions are neighbors. In the Canaanite woman episode, we see something similar. Instead of a powerful ally where there's recent and powerful and horrible tensions, the Canaanite represents long-standing aggression, just centuries of conflict and hostility between the peoples. But because of this long-term hostility and conflict, there's intimacy, right? Jesus' genealogy has Canaanites in it. I think this is very similar to the situation that prevails between blacks and whites, a long-standing enmity between these two peoples. And I just think her posture is so interesting for that reason. She accepts the stereotype of being a dog because she knows that there are major trust issues when it comes to dealings between Canaanites and Jews. She also trusts that Jesus' love can transform this relationship. I think one of the real differences between why Jesus' approach to the centurion is not quite as hostile as the approach to or hostile is not the right word, troubling, that's a good word, troubling, is because of the difference in how long these communities had been in conflict. And so Canaanites are analogous, in my view, to white allies. They have to acknowledge their unworthiness. They know that they are perennial enemies. The submissiveness and the respectfulness on the part of these allies has to be more pronounced because of these issues of trust. And because she knows that there's just a long history of conflict. They listen and learn, allies do, and engage deeply with what the oppressed say, even when it hurts. I think this is my last one. The Pharisees are perennial enemies, don't have a lot of time. There's a lot of conflict between Jesus and the Pharisees, but I want to just look at least at the snake imagery. In Jewish texts, snake imagery is used to talk about sin, deception, and death by poison, so death. So within the household of faith, when Jesus talks about Pharisees in these kinds of terms, using this kind of imagery, the emphasis comes on a couple of things. They need to produce fruit of repentance. They over-rely on ancestry. and they focus on religious status. I call Pharisees frenemies inasmuch as they are bound together. I think these frenemies are the vast majority of white Christians who remain in ignorance about the suffering and oppression of their brothers or sisters of color in Christ. But I like this because they are in the same household. They are bound together. This is the picture of what discourse between communities of Christians from communities of color and white Christians, that we are desperate to get it right. We are passionate about getting it right, and we're locked into, even if it's conflict, we're locked together in it. And so I'll just end with that, because I'm already over time. Thank you very much.
Good evening. An invitation. Here's an invitation. This is what I heard as I perused through Dr. Sechrest's paper focusing on loving the other in the gospel. It was not the first time I received this invitation, as I had actually perceived it and even acknowledged it and accepted it many times before. The first time I received this invitation, I was sitting in a pew and the response appeared as to having a taste test of juice and bread. After some time, I came to realize the invitation was actually a sacrament, a time of worship, to remember the sacrifice Christ bore for my sins. As an adult, I realized my impressions as a child and a young adult were not at all wrong, but were merely the start in me coming to understand the depth of the invitation that originated when Jesus instituted the Last Supper, the invitation, as captured in Matthew 26:17-30. This invitation was not just to partake of the Lord's Supper, it was to come, to sit and partake of the communion table, to engage, to contribute, to enjoy, to listen, to hear, to feel, to see, taste, to grow, to bless, to be enlightened, to love, to forgive, to honor, to serve, to receive, and through it all, be reconciled and be part of community. Communion, reconciliation, community. At the communion table, there is communication of a promise or a need. There is confession of shortcomings or unwavering grace and mercy. And there is a conversion of the heart or the soul. Once again, communication, confession, conversion is what I believe Dr. Sechrest's manuscript affirms as the element that must take place in order for one to be able to fulfill God's commandment of loving your enemy as depicted in Matthew 5:44. We see these three components in the healing of the Canaanite daughter and the servant of the centurion. As Dr. Sechrest shared in her paper, these two Gentiles were the only two to dialogue with Jesus. Here we see communion. Both reached out to Jesus for grace across the lines of profound enmity and showed their desire to be connected to him. There we see confession. And then we witness conversion when she states they are humbled, respectful, and differential. They trust Jesus, have confidence in his ability to meet the present need, and we see and witness that they are healed. An additional component I would like to highlight in these two Gentiles is their disposition and the manner in which they chose to exercise their will, to respond to the invitation, to exercise communion, to commit to community, and to love our enemy is dependent on our will, our posture, inclination, and resolve. It's our choice, and it starts with me. Though communion at church in the company of believers is sacred and has its own unique purpose, can we challenge our paradigms to believe that this act of worship, of reflection, of sanctification, of transformation, of reconciliation can also be embodied each time we accept the invitation to engage with each other, to love others, to exercise enemy love, to enter into community, and to love mercy and do justice? On page 4, when Dr. Sechrest begins to share the steps we just heard as she shared for doing the work of social justice, allies, or engaging in anti-racist activist development, she is really inviting us to exercise communion within our everyday context. Ownership of one's identity as racial being, the theory that explores the psychological, intellectual, moral, and material cost to whites of racism, gaining knowledge about oppression through formal and informal educational experiences and interpersonal relationships, take action in their own communities, and humility are the steps she shared. These are the elements that permeate the sacred act of worship. Or is it that God, our faith, our beliefs begin to permeate who we are in our everyday life, and being ally is not just about doing, but also about being? I must admit that because of my culture and heritage, I've witnessed and have experienced firsthand racism from individuals in the white community. But I have also experienced discrimination amongst people of ethnic communities, and at times even my own race, culture, and family. These steps and this invitation, the call to be allies, exists wherever power and privilege have allowed for the other to be dehumanized and injustice has dominated their engagements. As depicted in this essay, ally, neighbor, allies, foes, frenemies, this invitation is for you. This invitation is for all of us. We chose to be here this weekend. Actually, I can confidently state, just by being here, we have already accepted this invitation. We have come to the table of communion. We have come to be reconciled. We have come to enter into community. So let us abandon our posts, our comfort zones, and our paradigms, and let us enter into communication with God and with each other. Let us confess our faults to God and to each other. And may we all be converted, transformed, and renewed in God's presence and in the presence of each other. Let us, as Dr. Sechrest stated, squarely face the lack of trust and conflict bequeathed, and dare to imagine the new creation that Jesus represents, the beloved community. Thank you.
The presenter has the right of first response.
Well, I don't want to talk more. I already did too much talking, but I'm just so grateful for that response. Reverend Gonzales, is it Reverend Gonzales? Pastor Gonzales, that'll work. I just loved the way that you synthesize these ideas: communication, confession, conversion, confidence, community, and choice. And that you've made us to reflect about our presence here tonight as making a choice. I the way that you talked about ownership of one's identity as racial beings, you said it in a particularly crisp way that reminded me of a concept I've come across called the oppression Olympics, right? Where communities of color, right, try to outdo each other in terms of who's the biggest victim. Not helpful. But ownership of our own stuff and recognition that, right, everybody's got pain, I think is an important caveat. So thank you very much for that. This idea of that being an ally is about not just doing, but also being. And the way you touched on internalized racism, I've actually done another piece on Jesus and a Canaanite woman, and I think that is something that I think emerges in that episode worth thinking about. And so you absolutely nailed that this is an important thing for, right, it's not what I was trying to do here, but it's the costs of racism to people of color. They're infinitely worse, right? I'm talking about the cost to whites because white folk don't usually think about it. And it's pretty obvious to people of color, but that is one of the ones that needs more attention. So I'm so grateful for your response. Thank you.
Okay, we come to time for conversation and questions from the floor. I would ask just a couple of things. One, that when you have your turn, that you stand, that you identify yourself, and that you keep your question focused and brief so that there's time for everyone. Please, Bruce.
Thank you. I'm Bruce Fields from Theological School, and I want to thank Dr. Sechrest for the presentation that was made. Suppose I recognized the parallels that you drew in types of enemies, frenemies that existed. Could you comment further on, well, what would compel me? What would create the warrant for me to act on what I know? Right? In other words, it's possible to be confronted with and be cognizant of truth.
Yes.
But in this situation with power dynamics and the like, what would compel me to embrace the potential transformation? I know you touched upon the effects of racism upon whites. That's a very, very telling thing, but is there anything in addition that you would want to appeal to say that it's one thing to know, but let me compel you to respond?
That's a hard question. That's a hard question. Dr. Fields, I've been just thinking about this for a very long time. So you commented on what I was doing in this section on the cost of racism to whites. That was sort of the fruit of a lot of reflection on this. I wanted to try to make a compelling case. And if you noticed, most of that, I think I had 6 things, 5 of them were secular. 5 of them were secular. The last one was unrighteousness. It's like the gospel demands it. I could get up here and preach on the book of Ephesians and give you biblical warrant. But that isn't what I was trying to do. But you ask a really hard question. The first time I started teaching a race class, I had a student, so I teach in an MDiv program. I had a student who challenged me to show him where in the Bible multi-ethnic congregations are mandated. I mean, it's a stunning question, but I so appreciated the honesty there, right? I absolutely appreciate the honesty there. I think it's in Ephesians. I think that my book has a wonderful section on it. Yeah, oh, that's yeah, that's really good. I get challenged on that quite a bit as well in my classes. Are you Rebecca? You're not Rebecca. Who are you? Kelly, sorry. I have a really bad thing with names, so I apologize in advance. Kelly, that's a really good question. And if I'm going to be really honest, and I do have a lot of reading for my students who are biracial, so that they can see themselves right in the course materials. But the warning I have is that sometimes politically, the biracial identity can act as it can be problematized as an escape valve, right? So for instance, Barack Obama is biracial, but that's not why his biracial identity is not why he can't get right. Okay, I have to say no further, right? So it's the binary nature of the racialized society we live in that makes biracial identity problematic. It was originally intended by activists to try to complicate these binaries. Instead, sometimes it can act because what it says is okay, I'm neither this or that, I'm mixed, but in emphasizing mixed, you leave this or that unproblematized. Do you see? So it has to be, we have to affirm biracial identity at the same time that we say everybody is biracial. There is no such thing as pure white or pure black. Everyone is mixed. We're human. Like, this is a social construction. Did that make sense? Sorry. I get so excited. I get so excited. I'm just holding on to the mic now.
We have to use this for the online folks.
Oh,
Okay.
sorry.
They're not picking up the questions.
My name's Valerie. I'm an MDiv student here, and I think I could talk. I really appreciated your paper because it addresses, I think, the role of whites beyond just to know their privilege, and I think that helps. But I think the question that was in my head as I was reading it, being part of lots of different multiracial communities, was what do you think is or can there be a role in multiracial churches for white people to be sort of the lead pastor role or whatnot? And if it is, what does that look like in a way that doesn't unintentionally abuse power?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. These are not easy answers. There are no easy answers on that one. And I'm going to be really transparent here. The best multi-ethnic church I had ever attended began with co-pastors, black and white. I'm sorry. There were two pastors in the church. The black pastor was the senior pastor, and the white, because they were deliberately trying to invert power dynamics. And maybe it was because my consciousness hadn't evolved yet, but that came across because, in my view, the white pastor was so much more talented. And I remember thinking, oh, that's so paternalistic. I remember thinking that, right? And I actually, I left that church. I sort of didn't go back. And when they eventually, the black pastor moved on and it became a multiracial church under a white pastor's lead, I went back. He was wonderful. Best pastor I've ever had in my life. So humble. That was who he was. So I'm just being honest, right? That the racial dynamic is so poisonous that it really does complicate this whole notion of merit. So I teach this method of using analogy to try to perform ancient texts in modern, very different contexts. And one of the best ones my students came up with was one using Acts 6. Right, the selection of the deacons, in a place where an ethnic part of the church, the Hellenistic widows, were being overlooked. Right, the apostles go and pick Hellenistic deacons to manage that, and these students said, "Hey, that's affirmative action." And as they unpacked that, they were careful to note the criteria upon which those deacons were selected, right? They were qualified. And it's one of the reasons why affirmative action has become into disrepute these days, is because it casts a pall over someone's selection. Like, did you get that job because you're black or because you're qualified? So I don't have answers on this. All I'm saying in answer to your question is a great question, and it's complicated, and right, Holy Spirit. And Jesus. You know?
I'm Tyler, an MDiv student here at the seminary. First you talked about stereotypes. I come from a small town community, and a lot of times there are stereotypes, even between big city, people who live in big cities, and people who live in small towns. Small town white people are considered more ignorant, more racist. This is a question for both of you. What can we in small towns do theologically and practically in our churches to help bridge that divide and that stereotype?
Rebecca Love says you have to go first.
So I can say from my experience, what has worked out is where we have joined in community to serve another community. And so that has been done by first taking, I have lived that starting through a youth context. So taking us 4 or 5 youth from a church out in Connecticut and taking youth from a church in Chicago and bringing them together with several youth leaders and just hang out, have fun, have pizza for a weekend and do some great things in both communities for a weekend. So the Chicago kids travel there, Connecticut travel here. Then from there, then you identify a community, whether it be in Connecticut or in Chicago. This is what our experience. We ended up identifying one in Chicago, in which we can serve together. And so that went into a week-long service project of youth groups coming together with their leadership who were college students. So in essence, you have 2 generations coming together to serve a community. And then not only are they serving in community, they're living together in community, and then they're having fun, fellowship in community, and worship, serve, fun. And then from that experience, basically what ended up happening is that then it basically brought a revival in both church communities to where then the adults were doing it, the children were doing it, but at only like a weekend trip. The youth were doing it. And so it was a 10-year experience and development of having community, worshiping together, having fun together, and just collaborating. And at times, obviously, going from an urban context in Chicago and not having the resources to pay, so we would leverage what can we bring to the table to enhance this experience. And then the people from the white privilege that had resource, what can we bring to the table? And it wasn't a sense of taking advantage of either one's of their giftings, but more of a sense of serving each other. And so, and then we would have also, so there would be also the context of community in small groups, and then the context of community in big groups within that within those experiences, to allow people to reflect, to voice, to share their concerns, both with their own groups, but also together. And by the end, obviously, so it went on for years going that way. So that's an opportunity, moving away from our comfort zones and stepping into communion.
Thank you for that answer. I so wholeheartedly agree that life together in community is the answer. Social psychology studies have shown that attitudes about racism are mitigated in the context of integration. Integration works. It really does, which is why the fact that evangelical churches especially tend not to be integrated is also tied to the fact that the highest degree of racial animus in American society is in evangelical churches, among evangelicals. We have the biggest problem on race because our churches are segregated. So life together, absolutely. In my own life, I would only add, right, because that's just research, but in my own life, and I think in the gospel, in the Apostle Paul, it's the notion of being interdependent. That's what you were saying. Everybody brings something that's needed, like each brings something important that the other needs. So you have to come as valued members of the community. If in the presence of racial stereotyping, right, that interrupts that whole thing. So we have to live together long enough to find out how the stereotypes are false. And that's going to take a lot of work because stereotypes are really resilient. What tends to happen is people say, oh, you're not like the rest of them. That's what will happen. Until you get to know enough of them that you realize, oh, actually, none of them are kind of like that. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Heather Perkins, and I'm a student here. What practical first steps might you suggest for a white church that may not even really recognize privilege yet?
That's a hard one. They're all so hard. I can only give you my own, just experience. And what I do in my classes is I start with a really accessible text to read together. I wouldn't start, for instance, with Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me. That's jumping into the deep end. But one that's been used quite often, InterVarsity uses it a lot, I use it in my class as well, is Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria by, is it Beverly? Tatum, Beverly Tatum. So reading that in community can be, that actually, many of my students report that book has been life-changing for them. So that's one thing to start with. There's an exercise that I do in all my classes. It's actually one that you have to be very thoughtful of when you introduce it, because it does do the notion of privilege. Anyone know the privilege walk? Powerful. It is a powerful illustration of how complicated privilege is. Privilege is always relative, right? So as a professor, I have privilege that you don't have, right? So to say that because I'm black and female, I'm completely underprivileged is reductionistic. And so that exercise shows how complicated privilege is. But even accounting for all of that, in a multi-generational group, and you have to do it in multi-generational, multi-ethnic groups, you will find that, right, people of color tend to be further behind, to experience more disadvantage, but it reveals the advantages that is constitutive of privilege. I use it in week 8 of 10, and the light bulb goes on. The light bulb goes on. So that one is being used in a lot of university settings. The version I use comes from Georgetown University. All incoming freshmen take that, do that exercise. And even though now I'm known on campus for doing this thing, because it's kind of hard to hide. So I'm on campus, and people are lined up, and I'm shouting out. It's really cool. So they know, but they know it's coming. And it is still a very powerful illustration. And there's lots of internet things that talk about advantage and disadvantage, privilege and disadvantage. So there's just a host of resources. Once you start looking for them, they're all over the place.
One moment. Just one moment. Go ahead.
So I guess my response is pretty simple. It might seem simplistic, but sometimes, I mean, you mentioned a church that hasn't even, is not even aware. And so I don't want to be redundant, but just even a simple, it could be either from someone in the church that an interest might spark, but how do you start creating curiosity about what life is different than us? So whether it be at having food together or speaking, invite someone that is not, who is the other, to be part even of just the picnic day or the rummage sale, or a dinner, or share their story, especially if it's a story that resonates with that church community, but that they would not imagine that the other would have that similar story. And then it begins to trigger the curiosity. And with that start of the curiosity and hope and wisdom and the Spirit, then you'll be able to begin to start having questions arise and conversation come up. The other element is experience. So it doesn't have to go from one state to another state. I mean, for some maybe, but for the most of us, it's not that long of a distance. But having an experience with the other, and it might be a 1-hour experience, a 3-hour experience, going to the other community to experience something. It might be a service project or something. And it's just starting that spark and that curiosity that then brings about the questions, which then starts the conversation, and then it goes from there. Because sometimes you can't even get someone to read a book on something that they're not aware of or have owned. And then I have to speak from the ethnic side too. Something that I learned from my experience is that, so in experience of working in a nonprofit sector, is not just enough to receive the check of donation from privilege, but invite them to stop by and come for 15 minutes or 30 minutes. And sometimes you might think, well, someone who wants to give a big donation. But there's a lot of people that would be, out of respect, willing to come back. And that's a way of us, probably, the people of ethnic or the others, to invite people of privilege into our context and into our community or into our world and our experiences and our stories, to begin, once again, to trigger the curiosity and to have the conversations. And then from there, then it just starts. It just takes a small spark, and then it'll rise up into a transformation.
I fear I may be putting the brakes on some pretty important conversations, but I wanted to pick at a nit a little bit, if I could. In your discussion of the Canaanite woman encounter, you ended with, it's a little differently here than it was on the slide, but trust that Jesus' love can transform the terms of this encounter. And maybe I've been influenced by a sermon I read of Brian Blunt's some years ago called Make Me Want to Holler. This is one of the few encounters where I'm really ticked off at Jesus. And so help me see Jesus' love in this encounter, because it seems like it's the Canaanite woman's insistence that transforms the encounter and not Jesus' love. And if that's so, or if I'm wrong, then fine. But if that's so, how might that affect our conversation? Because the bottom line is I have a hard time seeing Jesus' love in this encounter.
He does heal the girl.
No doubt. But that's true. But I wonder if it's not.
I'm just saying, as a mom, that would make
that. I understand that. But I'm not sure. I'm not sure that. I think the encounter was transformed before he healed the girl. I think that because the encounter was transformed, he healed the girl. Yeah. And I want to say it's her insistence on being heard. I mean, and there's actually a ripple. First he ignores her, then he doesn't speak to her, but he speaks to the disciples, and then finally he speaks to her. But she continues to insist to be heard. And I think that transforms the encounter much more than Jesus' love. And my mom and dad may not like that because I'm going against everything I learned in Sunday school. Because
Well,
Jesus loves me. But, you know,
yeah, no, I hear you.
I'll stop. That's
That-
the nit I wanted to pick.
That's not a nit. That's such an important, that's not a nit. I have much to say on that episode. And there's very little that you said that I disagree with. It's a troubling episode. And only honest interpreters are going to admit that. It is just a troubling episode. And I could even pick out even more things about that episode that make it troubling. And there is no way to rescue it. And I just think that that's really honest. But I do want to maintain that I do think that her persistence is evidence of her trust in his ability to do something different. Right? Right? I mean, so that became a very important marker for me in understanding that. And even Jesus is complicated in this one, right? So how many times did I mention this evening, the notion that there are Canaanites in Jesus' ancestry? Yet he treats this Canaanite really badly. So internalized racism, anyone? Right? There's a history of long conflict. It's complicated. So it is a very troubling thing. What I am trying to do in this paper, there is another work that I've done in progress. It's not been published yet, but where I analyze all of the difficult, problematic things in that episode, and finally, I want to use that episode to talk about how it puts everyone at the same level in the Christian community. Like, so many of my students, when they read that story, and if you read a lot of commentaries, the same is true, they will be reading the story from the perspective of Jesus. When all the Gentiles in this room should be reading the story from the perspective of the woman. And so it becomes a powerful anti-racist tool, really. It's an elaboration of the comment, the ground at the foot of the cross is level. It's an illustration of that comment. But what I'm trying to do in this piece is one of the very troubling things for me in this episode is the comparison between it and the centurion, how Jesus responds to the centurion versus how he responds to the... It's one of the things that makes it even worse, right, because of the gender dynamics and the power dynamics. And as I just dwelled on that, Dr. Spinks, this is where the insight that it's harder to reconcile with a long-term enemy. That's where that insight came from.
I was tracking on that.
Yeah.
I guess I was just picking on the love language.
Yeah. Well, I may be taking liberties, but I was using the fact of her trust.
Yes. Okay.
Right? As what is she trusting in? Not just Jesus' ability to heal, right? But that he will respond. That, I think, is what powers her persistent. Or at least that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Valerie?
Okay. How do we, when we're discussing race and racism in a multi-cultural ethnic background, maintain the tension of the dominant culture and the pain of those outside of the dominant culture, and yet also dealing with our own self-critique of our issue? I find that when we are having those conversations in a multicultural arena like this, even though we'll talk about racism, then we will, in our example, try to affirm, not that saying you did it, but example, but I went to a church and the white pastor was really, I'm from an ethnic background, and even though we might not have money from the white people, there's something that we can contribute also so that we're at that same level. That tension where and I know we need to self-critique ourselves, But the conversation would be very different if it was not a multicultural arena and we're talking about race and racism. So how do we do that?
Thank you for that question. I think it's an important one. I hope that in the paper I've tried to be careful to not play the false equivalency game. I think that's what you're pointing out. That's the dynamic that may have prevailed in this conversation tonight. I think that's a valid critique. And in the paper, I try to go out of my way to say, I'm talking about the cost of racism to whites, but in no way do I mean to say that that's equivalent to what people of color express. Right? I think I say that 2 or 3 times because I don't want to engage in that. But what I'm trying to do tonight is I'm trying to tonight I am trying to I began, what stimulated the paper for me, I am always, and I am in progress on this, but I am always trying to resolve the conflict between my ethnic identity and my Christian identity. What I'm called to do as a follower of Jesus Christ versus what I see to be the need for justice in this broken world. That is the question that I am constantly in wrestling with, and I read lots of people of color with whom I do not agree because they keep pushing me on this. They keep telling me that's internalized racism, love. You know, following a suffering Jesus and you suffering already, and you're asking for more suffering to be like him. That's crazy. Right, so I'm constantly challenged by people who speak that to me. But I'm also determined that I'm not going to give up what I see as some pretty central components in the gospel. The gospel does call us to imitate Jesus. So I'm always having to resolve this conflict. And the way I started the paper is, I know this is not a conflict that white folk get. Because they don't see themselves as right oppressed or like that more suffering is dysfunctional when you're already suffering. Right? I mean, I know that I know that I'm sharing something that's going on in my inner world with a lot of people who don't understand my inner world. I mean, I know that's a part of what I'm about tonight in this gathering. I guess what I tried to do here is to say what I wrote on paper tries to avoid self-flagellation. It tries to focus on what we as disciples of Christ owe to people we are in conflict with. That's what I tried to do in the paper, inasmuch as I know that a lot of that what I've said in the paper is not the lived reality. I am trying to give voice to that in my personal remarks. So thank you for the question. It's an important one. If you haven't read the paper, read it. And if you think I missed somewhere, I really want to hear it because I don't want it to go out that way. Right? Yeah, no, so, I got your paper with more data on it, but both of your response is just causing me to be. Yeah. I think that's an important critique. Yeah, it's an important critique. I'm just gonna leave it at that.
I've got 3 hands in about 7 minutes. Sean.
Hello, I'm Shauna Hart, and I'm an MDiv student here at North Park. And I grew up in 2 cities that were predominantly white, and the churches I went to were predominantly white. And after moving to Chicago, I have had more interaction, and coming to the seminary has given me a safe place to explore things that I know nothing about. And with all my heart, I am so afraid I'm going to put my foot in my mouth, but I also have to be brave. I guess what I'm asking, you gave some very practical advice to what dominant culture people, being myself, can do. And I guess some of it is I want to tell you my experience, and I want my experience to be heard. But with the deepest place inside me, I really do want to understand, and I don't know if I can, but I feel like because this is a safe place for a conversation, I'm allowed to ask. But I have been numerous times to churches where I am the only white person, and I have not been addressed, talked to, looked in the eye, period whatsoever. So you're asking me to walk into a situation that's very uncomfortable, and I know that's what people do every day, and I've done it over and over. And it's not just black, white, Asian, white. It's not that at all. But I don't understand what's going on in their minds. I've also been in white churches where nobody talked to me. So, I don't think that it's just that. But also when I go in a church and I'm white, it's very obvious that I'm white, and so I just want to say I have tried it over and over, but I come to this place of a hand in the face, or that's how it feels, and I don't know what to do with that or what to do about it, besides trying over and over. Is there any other advice you would have? No. Okay.
I just said keep trying over and over. Don't give up. You have as much, I want to be respectful of other people's reflections upon my words, but you have as much to grow as the people in that community as well. So just your mere presence is birthing curiosity as much as it is to you.
It is very difficult to be the only one in a dominant society or culture space. And it's part of why I'm convinced that I used to try to integrate churches by myself, me and my family. We were going to integrate the church. And the last time I tried that, it was when the church started playing bluegrass music, which animates fear in me. I'm not kidding. It just animates a flight thing for me, that I realized that we have to have intentionally interracial congregations in order to make real progress. Although I would be a hypocrite if I didn't say for a lot of my life, so I'm called to this work of race relations, and so I tried, integrating places and going in multiracial spaces. And here recently, I've gotten to the point where I can't do it anymore. It's just too painful. And so after years of being non-denominational, so making commitments to particular congregations, I am proud to be AME because I can't do, this is not something individuals can do, communities must.
Jeffrey was next, and this may be it. We'll see where we go.
I don't need microphone. What do you do for the online people? Oh, I see. Thanks. You spoke about the cost to white people of racism. I was first made aware of this by reading an essay by Wendell Berry called The Hidden Wound. I'm wondering if you can recommend any other writings or essays which would speak to that issue so that whites can know just what the cost is.
I'm sorry, there's kind of Black Lives Matter syllabus. There's, since the various movement, they have Black church syllabus, Black Lives Matter syllabus, and where they have several scholars who have lists of not just Black, thank you, several scholars who have lists of 40 to 50 different books and papers that's out there. There's a whole website.
covers it, then Deborah.
So I'm sitting here burning. I don't know if this is a question as much as it's a comment. So you have given some practical suggestions and ideas, but something I did not hear, it's on an individual level. If you don't know where you are interculturally, how can you be part of a greater movement? How can you be part of a healthy movement? You just mentioned that bluegrass music strikes fear in you. So what kind of resources can we use? Well, one we're using here is the IDI. I like to think of when we're in a group like this, you have a herd mentality. We think alike sometimes, we have the same understanding and conflicts and all of that. But then on an individual level, when you take an assessment or any other kind of resource to help identify where you are and what you need to do to grow and to develop.
That's a great question. In my race class, the very first day of class, I start with the implicit attitudes test, which is Harvard has a website where people can go on and find out about their implicit attitudes about race. And no one likes their scores. People of color and whites alike, because racism is a smog, as Beverly Tatum says, that you cannot but be changed by. It affects all of us. The good news, though, is that your IAT values will change as you come of awareness. So that's where I start, right? A benchmark. I'm trying to take off the table that I'm not racist or I'm not prejudiced, because those are two different concepts, right? What I say in the paper bears saying out loud here. I think I said it in the presentation as well. I'm experimenting with this idea of white affinity groups. I'm helping 2 white women at Fuller start a white affinity group, and they're terrified of starting a group for whites to talk about racism, right? They're terrified. Can you imagine? Can you imagine starting that here? What people would say? But I think it's an important place for whites to go, have a place to go, and not burden people of color to teach them, right, to give them resources, but where they can do the work themselves in a place of safety and not depend on kind of being spoon-fed. Because I think sort of taking ownership for your education is something important that we are trying to communicate as teachers in higher education anyway, right? So I'm walking alongside these 2 women to see how that goes, just as just to help them think through, how to position themselves on campus as allies, but trying to do the work without being a burden on the communities of color in our community. So I'll let you know how it goes.
Let's express our thanks to both Rob and Rebecca. If you notice the schedule for the symposium, we quite intentionally have prayers the Thursday and Friday nights, and we close the symposium with a worship service as a way to keep reminding ourselves that we do theology in a context of worship. So there is a rule that is in operation tonight. For the next 5 minutes, there can be no conversation in this room. You need to go out the door, down to the other end of the hall, down the steps to the chapel where we will have prayers for 15 minutes. Then after that, there will be coffee in the lounge immediately below us, and you can talk all night long. So let's go to prayers. Thank you. Thank you. On the one thing on text on the multi-ethnic church, sure, the Acts 13.
Do you not have a desire for it?